Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to another video. And today we'll be talking about the ARC-170 and why it ultimately fell out of popular use in the Star Wars galaxy. The ARC-170, or the Regressive Reconnaissance 170, was of course a Republic starfighter made famous during the Clone Wars. It was an Incom product and, unsurprisingly, based on the wings, it was, according to the Revenge of the Sith cross-section, a cousin to the Z-95 and thus a predecessor to the galaxy's most famous and perhaps effective starfighter, the X-Wing. The ARC-170 was armed to the teeth. It had two very powerful forward-facing blaster cannons, which the cross-section also notes were much more powerful than the typical ship-based laser cannons of that era. It also had a proton torpedo launcher and, quite interestingly, a pair of manned rear-facing laser cannons. These guns, alongside the ship's powerful shields, helped increase survivability, especially where the thing was larger and slower than 95% of other starfighters on the battlefield at this point. The ARC-170 was a fairly complex craft to fly. It required not only a pilot, but also a co-pilot and a gunner who managed the rear-facing cannons. I guess that suggests that the cannons were probably fire-linked, but I wouldn't doubt that the gunner could also take control of each one individually. It just wouldn't be very practical in the heat of battle unless we're talking about a Jedi. The ARC-170 did also use an astromech droid alongside a hyperdrive, which we'll come back to in just a second. You likely won't be surprised to hear that because of the ship's heavy armament and effective shielding, it was usually used as a heavy assault fighter. Useful for attacking capital ships with its torpedoes and laser cannons, but also fending off other starfighters. Probably a bit more mobile than something like a Y-Wing. What you may not know, but you probably should if you think about the name, is that the ARC-170, the Aggressive Reconnaissance 170, was very frequently utilized for long-range missions. The ship could carry several days' worth of supplies. It had advanced sensors built into its nose, not unlike the X-Wing, so it would often be relied upon in a scouting role, or in cases when a ship would attack maybe behind enemy lines, away from reinforcements, wherever. This is something that the Rebel Alliance would do with ships like the Y-Wing. Basically, if you can't support your starfighters with a capital ship, you get in there, do as much damage as possible, try to survive, and hyperspace jump away. Arguably, because of the Clone Wars nature, these hit and fade attacks were a little less successful, but that was definitely some of the action that the ARC-170 would have seen alongside more traditional battles like we see with Coruscant. That's a lot of the good. Let's talk about the bad, and I covered one of the major things already. The ARC-170 was slow and unwieldy. Both the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War saw fast starfighters like the TIE Interceptor and the A-Wing dominate in dogfights, so these things were definitely a bit of a sitting duck, not unlike, again, the Y-Wing or especially the TIE Bomber. One other issue, though, with the ARC-170 is the cost in both replacement technology and, more importantly, personnel. The ARC-170 needed 3 pilots and an astromech droid. If you lose your ship, you are losing a lot in terms of personnel, everything that comes with them, training, equipment, and more. And the Saga Edition Starship of the Galaxy guide also notes specifically that these ships, even when they managed to survive, were very resource intensive and required a lot of repairs and regular maintenance. So why did the ARC-170 fail? And I would call the ship a failure. It did do some things effectively, but the Saga Edition notes that it didn't see wide production numbers even during the Clone Wars, at least compared to other Republic-era fighters, and the Empire chose to drop the ship when the new era was founded in favor of other vessels. When it comes to the Clone Wars, I think the Republic frankly just preferred other designs, sometimes using 2 starfighters of different class to make up for what the ARC-170 could offer. For example, although the ARC-170 is somewhat unique in the Republic's Navy as a heavy assault fighter, the Y-Wing does a lot that the ARC-170 does, while also being less expensive and less crew intensive. The Y-Wing carries more ordnance, it's also slow with a decent shield, and even has the gunner. The downside is that the Y-Wing was less of a dogfighter, but the Republic didn't really field the Y-Wing alone. It was usually protected by one of their many interceptor types, which they did make in numbers. So essentially, instead of having one ship that's pretty good at bombing and okay at dogfighting, they've got dedicated bombers and dedicated interceptors, and that seemed to work well for them. Seems like Republic starfighter manufacturing was also pretty heavily standardized, so it's not like the Alliance where they'd be conducting hit and run attacks and using whatever they had. It just seems that the Republic chose the effectiveness of the two ships combined versus the ARC-170. Again, it's not like these ships saw no production, but the Saga Edition Starship Guide specifically mentions that they were produced in much smaller numbers than the other ships. That takes us to the Imperial Era, and there were a few things that led to the ARC-170's downfall in that time period. For one, the Empire moved generally to light carrier-based fighters. The ARC-170 was frequently carrier-based, but it also did have that hyperdrive. Very few Imperial vessels had a hyperdrive. Almost all of them were connected to a mothership, and the heavy long-range fighter simply didn't fit very well with an Imperial doctrine. That being said, there were Imperial variants of the ARC-170. They were just even less common than what we saw during the Clone Wars. The Empire also preferred light, cheap fighters, and again, the ARC-170 had a noted high personnel and maintenance cost, so it doesn't really fit in, especially where the Empire gets a lot of their firepower from their capital ships, with starfighters seeming somewhat like an afterthought. Even the Rebellion didn't use ARC-170s very frequently. For one, there was a better successor ship, the YWing. It's a little less heavy, a little less protected than the ARC-170, but it's very mobile. It's got those heavy proton torpedo launchers, which is really what you need when taking down capital ships anyway. And it was a much better dogfighter, especially where the Y-Wing and the B-Wing did still exist to inflict casualties on capital ships. Yeah, I see the X-Wing as being better for the Rebel Alliance than the ARC-170 in almost every aspect, not only practically when it comes to missions, but again, returning to the Saga Edition Starship of the Galaxy Guide, that explains that even though some of the ships were liberated and used by the Rebel Alliance, most were mothballed or scrapped simply because the Rebels lacked the flight crews and repair bays necessary to keep the older ships ready for combat. And that makes total sense. You're dedicating 3 pilots to one ship. Yes, you're gaining rear-facing gunners, but the Rebels often chose not to even man their Y-Wing gunners because of personnel issues. A co-pilot, it's just a lot. The Rebel Alliance also relied, again, on hit-and-run attacks, but they were also very fast about it. They got in, they got out. The ARC-170 just doesn't offer the same thing that the X-Wing does. Was the ship useless, though? No, definitely not. As I mentioned, I think it worked pretty well in its specific niche, and if creative, I think the Rebel Alliance probably could have found some interesting uses. The Republic did have scout variants of the Y-Wing, so I don't think the ARC-170 was really needed for that, but I do think hit-and-run attacks behind enemy lines should have been the bread and butter of this ship. High-value targets where you can justify the 3 individuals plus an astromech droid needed for the ship, and where you want something that can stand on its own without having to dedicate more ships to protect it, whether because of manpower reasons or because of stealth. I think it's also a pretty interesting candidate for a planetary assault ship, and unsurprisingly, it does have a cousin, the PTB-625, very similar to the ARC, but much larger, and an airspeeder with a bomb bay. I think the ARC could have been even better in this role because it can launch, go through hyperspace, attack targets on the ground, then leave. Maybe they should have made a variant where the proton torpedo launch bay was swapped out for a bomb bay, and I can see that being very useful. But in my opinion, that's why the ARC-170 was somewhat of a failure for a starfighter, despite itself. I mean, it's a cool design. I think it does a lot of things pretty interestingly, but ultimately it was overshadowed by other starfighters of its era and certainly after. That's all for today, though, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. Until next time, be safe, have a good one, and may the Force be with you.